My son secretly dropped out of medical school and spent my money partying. Now he is demanding that I help him again? I sacrificed everything to put my son Jason through medical school, sold my rental property, cashed out my 401k early, took the tax penalty, worked double shifts as a nurse for extra money, moved to a one-bedroom apartment so he could focus on studying without worrying about money. Every month I sent him $5,000. Tuition, rent for his downtown apartment, food, books, everything covered. He promised he'd take care of me when he became a doctor, called me his hero, said he studied every night, sent me pictures in scrubs, talked about his rotations and professors. I was so proud. My son, the future doctor, 3 years of payments, $180,000 total. Then last month, I ran into his roommate's mother at the grocery store. She mentioned how nice it was that Jason and her son could build their entertainment company together. What entertainment company? What roommate? Jason lived alone to focus on studying. She looked confused. Her son had been living with Jason for 3 years. They threw parties every weekend, ran a DJ business together. Jason hadn't been in medical school since first semester. He dropped out after failing his first anatomy exam. Never told me. For 3 years, he'd been collecting my money, spending it on equipment for his DJ business, throwing parties, taking trips to Miami and Vegas, living his best life while I ate rice and beans to afford his fake tuition. I called the medical school. They confirmed he withdrew in 2021. The registrar said they'd sent several letters to his permanent address. My address. Jason had been intercepting my mail. I drove to his apartment that night. His real apartment, not the studio I'd been paying for. A luxury penthouse I'd never seen. Music equipment everywhere. Professional DJ setup, recording booth. 3 roommates I'd never met. Jason was in the living room mixing tracks. When he saw me, he didn't even look surprised, just annoyed that I'd shown up unannounced. I asked him about medical school. He shrugged, said it wasn't for him. Too much memorization, too many rules. He'd found his real passion in music, built a following, made connections. He was an artist now. I asked about the $180,000. He said that was an investment in his future. The money helped him network, build his brand, buy equipment. It all worked out because his business was taking off. He'd made $30,000 last year, only $150,000 less than what I'd given him. When I started crying, he told me to stop being manipulative. Said lots of parents support their kids' dreams, that I should be proud he found his calling. His roommates agreed, called me cool for funding his journey, like I had a choice, like I knew what I was funding. I left without saying anything else. Needed time to process the betrayal, the lies, the stolen years of my life working double shifts, the retirement money gone, the rental property I'd never get back. Jason didn't call to apologize, didn't text to explain, nothing for 2 weeks. Then yesterday, he called with excitement in his voice. Big news. He had an opportunity. A famous DJ wanted to collaborate. They could tour together, open a studio, build an empire. He just needed startup capital, $50,000. Since I'd already invested so much in his education, what was a little more for his actual career? He'd pay me back double when he made it big. Promise. Just like he promised to become a doctor. I told him I'd think about it. He said there wasn't time to think. The DJ was meeting with other potential partners. This was his shot. Our shot. We were a team. I was his business partner, not just his mother. Without me, none of this would exist. Which was true. Without me, he'd have had to get a job instead of pretending to study medicine. I asked him to meet me at my apartment to discuss terms. He showed up in a Tesla. Leased, he said, for his image. Part of the business. He brought contracts. Had everything planned out. I'd be a silent partner. 15% returns? My name nowhere on the documents because that would complicate taxes. But I could trust him. I let him present his whole pitch. Watched him pull up spreadsheets. Show me follower counts. Play his latest tracks. He talked for an hour about his vision, his talent, his destiny, how this was the universe rewarding my faith in him. Then I handed him an envelope. Inside the envelope were 3 documents. A cease and contact letter printed on law firm letterhead. A spreadsheet listing every single payment I'd made over 3 years with dates and amounts. A small claims court filing for the maximum amount allowed in our state. Jason pulled them out one by one. His confident smile faded as he scanned the first page. Then the second. His hand started shaking slightly when he got to the court filing. He looked up at me with confusion replacing the cocky expression he'd worn all evening. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I watched him realize I wasn't the easy target he'd counted on, that I'd actually done something instead of just crying and giving in like always. Jason set the papers down and laughed. It sounded forced and nervous. He said the legal papers were a joke, that I couldn't sue my own son. His voice had an edge to it now, not the smooth sales pitch from before. I told him my attorney explained that fraud is fraud no matter who commits it. Family relationships don't change the law. I had 3 years of documented lies, intercepted mail, fake photos and scrubs, made up stories about rotations and professors, every single piece of evidence saved and organized. His laugh died completely. He switched tactics fast. The tears came suddenly, streaming down his face as he said he thought I believed in him, that I supported his dreams, that parents are supposed to help their kids find their passion. His voice cracked just right. His shoulders shook. I stayed silent and watched him perform. Remembered how he'd cried exactly the same way when he showed me his fake medical school acceptance letter. The same hitching breath, the same wounded expression. Back then, I'd hugged him and told him how proud I was. Now I just sat there and let him work through his act. When the tears didn't work, his face changed. The sadness vanished like someone flipped a switch. Anger took its place, hot and immediate. He stood up fast enough that his chair scraped loudly against my floor. He said if I went through with this, I'd never see him again. He'd cut me out of his life completely. No calls, no visits, and no relationship. I'd lose my only son over money. I stood up too and told him he already did that. 3 years ago when he chose to steal from me instead of being honest, when he intercepted my mail and lied to my face every single day. I picked up my purse and headed for the door. His voice got louder. He called after me saying I was ruining his life, that I was supposed to be his mother, that the lawsuit would destroy his credit and his future. His roommate's doors opened. 3 guys emerged looking uncomfortable and confused. They'd clearly heard everything. One of them, younger with dark hair, looked genuinely shocked. He said quietly that they didn't know Jason was lying to me about school, that Jason told them the money came from his trust fund. The other 2 nodded, looking embarrassed. I believed the dark-haired one based on how stunned he seemed. Jason told them to shut up and go back to their rooms. They didn't move. I left without saying anything else. Got in my car with Jason still yelling from his doorway. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. But underneath the shaking was something else. Something stronger. I'd actually done it. Confronted him. Handed him legal papers instead of another check. Said no instead of yes. I drove home and sat in my parking spot for 10 minutes just breathing. Then I called Martina. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. I told her I went through with it, that I actually served him the papers and didn't back down when he cried and yelled. She said she was proud of me, that she knew how hard that must have been, that Jason had been manipulating me for years, and it was time someone stood up to him. The next morning, my phone started buzzing before I even got out of bed. Text after text from Jason. The first few were apologies saying he was sorry and didn't mean what he said. Then they shifted to threats about never speaking to me again. Then guilt trips about how I was ruining his life and destroying his dreams. How could I do this to him after everything? How I was supposed to love him unconditionally. How other parents support their kids without demanding payback. I screenshot every single message, forwarded them all to Samuel Cartwright, the attorney whose name was on the letterhead. He responded within an hour saying this was perfect, that the messages established a clear pattern of manipulation and would help our case significantly. Samuel called me that afternoon. He explained that small claims court had limits on how much I could recover. The maximum in our state was $15,000. But filing created an official legal record of the fraud. It put pressure on Jason to negotiate or face worse consequences. He said we might be able to pursue criminal fraud charges if we could prove Jason intentionally deceived me. The intercepted mail was strong evidence of intent. So were the fake photos and made-up stories about professors. Samuel said he'd handled cases like this before, and while they were difficult, they weren't impossible. Especially with documentation as thorough as mine. I met with Alana Devine 2 days later. Martina had recommended her as a financial advisor who specialized in helping people recover from major financial losses. Her office was small but professional with certificates on the wall and family photos on her desk. She was probably 50 with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She asked me to bring all my financial records, bank statements, tax returns, documentation of the rental property sale, my 401k withdrawal paperwork, everything. She spread it all out on her desk and started calculating. Her face stayed neutral, but I could see her jaw tighten as the numbers added up. Alana turned her computer screen toward me. She'd created a spreadsheet showing the full damage. $180,000 in direct payments to Jason. Another $90,000 in potential investment growth if I'd kept that money in retirement accounts instead of sending it to him. The rental property I sold would be worth $150,000 more in today's market based on area appreciation rates. The early 401k withdrawal cost me $40,000 in penalties and taxes that I paid to the government for nothing. She scrolled down. The numbers kept going. lost compound interest, reduced Social Security benefits because I'd worked fewer high-earning years, the opportunity cost of the double shifts I worked that damaged my health and left me exhausted. The total came to $460,000. Alana turned the screen back toward herself and clicked through a few more calculations. She printed out a summary sheet and slid it across the desk. The numbers looked even worse on paper. I'd need to work 10 more years than I planned, maybe longer depending on my health. My retirement wouldn't be comfortable anymore. It would be tight. Careful. Every dollar counted because Jason had taken the cushion I'd spent 20 years building. Alana asked if I had any questions about the projections. I shook my head. The numbers were clear enough. She suggested we schedule a follow-up meeting in 2 weeks to start planning recovery strategies. I agreed and wrote the date in my phone calendar. Then I just sat there staring at the paper. All those years of double shifts reduced to a spreadsheet showing how far behind I was. Alana didn't rush me. She kept working on her computer and let me process. After a few minutes, the tears started. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet crying that I couldn't stop. This was the first time I'd actually cried since discovering the truth. Everything before had been shock and anger and frantic activity. But sitting in Alana's office looking at the numbers made it real. Jason had stolen my future. Not just money, years of my life, the retirement I'd earned, the security I'd sacrificed everything to build. Alana pulled a tissue box from her drawer and set it next to me without saying anything. I took several tissues and tried to get control of myself. She waited until I'd stopped crying before speaking. She told me about resources for financial recovery after family fraud, support groups, legal aid organizations, financial counseling programs specifically designed for people rebuilding after this kind of betrayal. I realized from the way she talked that I wasn't the first parent she'd helped through this. Other people had sat in the same chair crying over the same kind of loss. That should have made me feel better, but it just made me sadder. How many parents had their kids done this to? 3 days later, Samuel called while I was at work. I stepped into the break room to take the call. He said Jason's roommate Joshua had reached out through a mutual contact. Joshua wanted to talk to me. Samuel said Joshua felt guilty about using my money without knowing where it came from. He had information that might help the case. Financial records from the business partnership. Documentation of how Jason spent the money. Samuel asked if I was willing to meet with Joshua. I said yes immediately. Any evidence that strengthened our position was worth pursuing. Samuel gave me Joshua's number and told me to let him know after the meeting. I called Joshua that afternoon. He suggested meeting at a coffee shop near campus the next day. His voice sounded nervous. Young. He apologized 3 times during our 2-minute conversation. I told him it was fine and confirmed the time and location. The coffee shop was busy when I arrived. College students everywhere with laptops and textbooks. Joshua had texted me a description of himself, so I spotted him right away. Tall kid with dark hair sitting alone at a corner table. He had a folder in front of him and kept glancing at the door. I walked over and introduced myself. He stood up so fast he almost knocked over his coffee. We shook hands and sat down. Joshua looked miserable. He started apologizing before I even got settled in my chair. Said he had no idea the money came from me. That Jason told him it was from an inheritance, that if he'd known the truth, he never would have accepted it. I believed him. His horror looked genuine. He pushed the folder toward me. Inside were printed financial records, bank statements, receipts, business expense reports, everything organized with tabs and labels. Joshua had put real effort into documenting this. He walked me through the records page by page, showed me exactly where my money went. $120,000 on DJ equipment over 3 years. Turntables, speakers, mixing boards, lighting systems, recording software, professional microphones. All top of the line because Jason insisted they needed the best gear to compete. Another $40,000 went to the luxury apartment and the Tesla lease. Joshua said Jason convinced him they needed to project success to attract better clients. That image mattered in the entertainment industry. The remaining $20,000 disappeared into trips, music festivals in different cities, networking events that were really just vacations. Miami, Vegas, Austin, Los Angeles. Jason called them business investments, but Joshua admitted most of the time they just partied and handed out business cards. I asked Joshua about the business's actual income. He looked even more uncomfortable. They'd made about $30,000 total across 3 years. Most gigs were small parties and college events that barely covered their expenses. The famous DJ collaboration Jason mentioned was just an email exchange with someone who had a modest following in the region. Not a tour, not a record deal. Just a guy who responded to Jason's messages a few times. Joshua said Jason had a habit of exaggerating opportunities, making small connections sound like major deals, convincing people his big break was always right around the corner. I asked why Joshua stayed partners with him for so long. He said Jason was charismatic, confident, made people believe in his vision even when the numbers didn't support it. But after learning the truth about where the startup money came from, Joshua couldn't work with him anymore. He was dissolving the partnership. He offered to testify if my case went to court, said he wanted to help make this right however he could. I took copies of all the business records, thanked him for his honesty. He apologized again as I left. I drove straight to Samuel's office. Samuel spread the documents across his desk and examined each page carefully. He asked questions about specific transactions, made notes on a legal pad. After 30 minutes, he sat back and smiled. This changed everything. Now we could prove Jason's intentional lies and trace exactly where the money went. The intercepted mail showed intent to deceive. The fake photos and stories about professors showed ongoing fraud. But Joshua's records showed the actual theft. Every dollar accounted for. Every lie documented. Samuel said he'd file an amended claim with this new evidence. It strengthened our position significantly. Made it much harder for Jason to claim misunderstanding or honest mistakes. We had proof of deliberate fraud spanning 3 years. 2 weeks after handing Jason the envelope, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice asked if this was Jason's mother. I said yes. He identified himself as Jason's father, my ex-husband. We hadn't spoken in 15 years. Not since the divorce when Jason was 8. He'd moved across the country, started a new family, sent child support checks but never called, never visited. Now suddenly he was on my phone asking to hear my side of the story. Jason had contacted him asking for money. He wanted to know what was really going on before he made any decisions. I told him everything. The fake medical school, the 3 years of payments, the DJ business, the luxury apartment and leased Tesla, the $180,000 gone, the legal papers I'd served, the evidence we were gathering. Jason's father stayed quiet through the whole explanation. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he admitted Jason had pulled something similar on him 5 years ago. Jason claimed he needed $10,000 for a summer medical program abroad. His father sent the money. 6 months later, he discovered through social media that Jason had actually used it for a trip to Ibiza with friends. No medical program, just another lie to get money for partying. I told Jason's father I'd think about his offer and hung up feeling strange. 15 years of silence, and now he wanted to help, because Jason tried the same trick on him. The $5,000 would make a difference with Samuel's legal fees, but taking money from him felt complicated. Martina said I should accept it when I called to tell her about the conversation. She reminded me that Jason's father had a responsibility to warn me about Jason's pattern of lying for money, and he failed to do that. The $5,000 was the least he could do after staying quiet while I got scammed for 3 years. I called him back the next day and accepted his offer. He transferred the money within hours and sent a brief email saying he wished he'd spoken up sooner. Samuel called 2 days later with news. He'd sent all our evidence to Jason's lawyer, including Joshua's business records and testimony offer. Jason's lawyer had reviewed everything and called Samuel back within 24 hours. They wanted to discuss mediation instead of going to trial. Samuel explained this was a good sign because it meant they knew their position was weak. The intercepted mail proved intent to deceive, and Joshua's records traced every dollar I sent directly to personal expenses and party equipment. If we went to court, the evidence would make Jason look terrible, and he could face criminal fraud charges on top of civil penalties. Mediation meant they wanted to settle quickly and quietly before things got worse for Jason. I asked Samuel what mediation would accomplish, and he laid out the reality. Court cases took months or years and cost thousands in legal fees with no guarantee of recovery. Mediation was faster and cheaper, and gave us leverage to negotiate a settlement where Jason would actually pay something back. Samuel said we had enough evidence to push for a real agreement with payment terms and legal acknowledgement of what Jason did. I wouldn't get all my money back, but I'd get more than if I just walked away, and I'd have legal documentation holding Jason accountable. I agreed to mediation, even though part of me wanted to drag Jason through court and make him face a judge. Samuel scheduled it for 3 weeks out to give us time to prepare our settlement demands. Martina helped me put together a list of what I wanted from mediation. Not just money, but acknowledgement and consequences. I wanted Jason to admit in writing that he lied and stole from me. I wanted a payment plan that would last years, so he'd face the consequences of his choices for a long time. I wanted him to sell his expensive DJ equipment to make an immediate payment that showed he was serious. Samuel reviewed my list and said most of it was reasonable, and we could push for all of it given our strong evidence. Before the mediation, I knew I needed help processing everything that happened beyond just the legal and financial aspects. Martina recommended a therapist named Charlotte Barker, who worked with family trauma and financial abuse cases. I called Charlotte's office and got an appointment for the following week. Her office was in a quiet building near the hospital where I worked, and the waiting room had comfortable chairs and calming artwork, Charlotte was younger than I expected, with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking that put me at ease immediately. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I explained the whole situation with Jason. The fake medical school, the 3 years of payments, the luxury apartment and DJ business, the legal case we were building. Charlotte listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, she asked me what felt most painful about what Jason did. I started to say the money but stopped because that wasn't quite right. The money hurt terribly, but the betrayal cut deeper. Jason had looked me in the eye for 3 years and lied. He'd sent me fake photos and made up stories about professors and rotations. He'd called me his hero while spending my retirement money on parties and trips. Charlotte nodded and said what Jason did wasn't just theft, but a profound violation of the trust between parent and child. She explained that my grief over losing the relationship I thought I had with Jason was just as valid as my anger over the money. I'd been mourning 2 losses at once: the financial security I'd worked decades to build, and the son I believed existed but never really did. That second loss was the one I hadn't let myself fully feel yet, because I was too focused on the practical problems of legal action and money recovery. We spent the rest of that first session talking about the difference between the Jason I thought I raised and the Jason who actually existed. Charlotte helped me see that I'd been a good mother who supported her child's education. Jason made the choice to exploit that support, and his actions reflected his character, not my failure as a parent. By the end of the session, I felt exhausted but lighter somehow. Charlotte scheduled me for weekly appointments leading up to the mediation. In our second session, Charlotte asked me what outcome from the mediation would feel like justice. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I didn't want Jason destroyed or homeless even after everything he'd done. Some part of me still remembered the little boy who used to bring me drawings from the school and tell me about his day. But I couldn't have a relationship with the man who stole from me unless he fundamentally changed and proved through years of consistent action that he understood what he'd done wrong. I wanted him to acknowledge his lies in writing. I wanted him to pay back whatever amount he could manage, even if it took a decade. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I wanted consequences that might actually teach him accountability instead of letting him walk away thinking he could manipulate his way out of anything. Charlotte asked if I thought Jason was capable of real change, and I admitted I didn't know. He'd shown no remorse when I confronted him at his apartment. But maybe facing legal consequences and losing his business partnership with Joshua had started to crack his confidence. Maybe being forced to acknowledge what he did in mediation would be the wake-up call he needed. Or maybe he'd just learn to be a better liar next time. Charlotte reminded me that I couldn't control whether Jason changed, but I could control how I protected myself going forward. The mediation was about establishing boundaries and consequences, not about fixing Jason or rebuilding our relationship. Those things might happen eventually if Jason did the hard work of becoming a different person, but they couldn't be my focus right now. My focus had to be on my own recovery and making sure Jason faced real accountability for his choices. 2 days before the mediation, Martina came over to help me prepare. She brought takeout food, and we sat at my small kitchen table going through different scenarios that might happen. Martina played Jason, trying different manipulation tactics while I practiced staying calm and focused on the facts. She pretended to cry and apologize dramatically. She tried guilt trips about being a bad mother. She offered vague promises about paying me back someday without any specific terms. Each time I responded with the same calm statements about documented evidence and legal accountability. Martina reminded me that I didn't owe Jason forgiveness or a relationship. Protecting myself financially and emotionally wasn't being a bad mother. It was being a smart woman who refused to be exploited anymore. We practiced until I could respond to Jason's likely tactics without getting emotional or backing down from what I wanted. Martina hugged me before she left and told me she was proud of how strong I'd become through this nightmare. The mediation took place in a conference room at a neutral office building downtown. Samuel met me in the lobby, and we rode the elevator up together. He carried a folder thick with evidence and documentation. The conference room had a long table with chairs on both sides and windows overlooking the city. A professional mediator arrived first and introduced herself. She explained the process and ground rules. Then Jason's lawyer arrived alone and set up his materials at one end of the table. Samuel and I sat at the other end. Jason came in last, walking slowly like he wasn't sure he wanted to be there. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt instead of his usual expensive streetwear. His hair was neat and his face looked tired. He sat down next to his lawyer and stared at the table. When I entered the room and took my seat across from him, he glanced up briefly, then looked away. He seemed smaller somehow without his usual confident performance. The mediator started by explaining that this was a voluntary process where both parties would have a chance to speak and hopefully reach an agreement that avoided court. She asked Jason to explain his perspective first. His lawyer nodded at him, and Jason cleared his throat. He gave what sounded like a rehearsed speech about being young and making mistakes. He said he got overwhelmed by medical school and panicked instead of talking to me honestly. He called it poor judgment and said he was sorry for not being upfront about dropping out. His lawyer had clearly coached him to minimize what he did. Jason never used words like fraud or theft. He never mentioned the 3 years of deliberate lies or the intercepted mail or the fake photos. He framed everything as a series of bad choices made by a confused kid who didn't know how to disappoint his mother. I watched him perform his apology and felt nothing but tired recognition of another manipulation attempt. When it was my turn to speak, I pulled out the statement I'd prepared with Charlotte. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the paper, but my voice stayed steady. I read about working double shifts as a nurse while my body ached and my feet swelled. I read about eating rice and beans for dinner so I could send Jason $5,000 every month. I read about cashing out my retirement early and taking the tax penalty because I believed I was investing in my son's future as a doctor. I read about selling my rental property that would have provided income in my retirement. I read about the 3 years of lies and intercepted mail and fake photos in scrubs. I read about discovering Jason lived in a luxury penthouse throwing parties while I lived in a one-bedroom apartment sacrificing everything. I read about the $180,000 gone and the additional hundreds of thousands in lost investment growth and retirement security. I read about having to work 10 more years than I planned and facing a diminished retirement because my son chose to steal from me. When I finished reading, there was silence in the room. The mediator looked at Jason and asked if he understood the harm he caused. There was a long pause. Jason's lawyer started to speak, but the mediator held up her hand. She kept her eyes on Jason and waited. Finally, he said yes quietly without looking up. His lawyer immediately tried to move the conversation toward settlement terms, but the mediator stopped him. She told Jason that she needed him to respond to what I'd said, not just acknowledge it. She asked him what specifically he understood about the impact of his actions on my life. Jason shifted in his chair and looked down at his hands for a long moment. The mediator waited without saying anything, and the silence stretched until it felt uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke in a quiet voice that sounded different from his usual confident tone. He said he knew what he was doing was wrong the whole time. He convinced himself that once his business took off and he made it big, he could pay me back and then I'd be happy for him. He thought if he could just show me success, it would erase the lying. He kept going because he was afraid to disappoint me and admit he failed at medical school. His voice cracked slightly when he said this, and I felt anger rise up sharp and hot in my chest. I leaned forward and told him he clearly wasn't afraid enough to stop stealing from me for 3 years. He wasn't afraid enough to stop intercepting my mail or sending fake photos or watching me work double shifts while he threw parties. The mediator held up her hand gently and asked me to let her handle the questioning, but I could see she understood my anger. She turned back to Jason and asked him if he understood that fear of disappointment doesn't justify fraud. He nodded slowly and said yes. She asked if he understood that his mother sacrificed her retirement and her health because she believed his lies. He said yes again, even quieter. Then she looked at both lawyers and said it was time to discuss settlement terms. Samuel opened his folder and pulled out the proposal we'd prepared together over the past week. He laid out the terms in a calm, professional voice that made everything sound reasonable and fair. Jason would pay back $50,000 over 10 years through monthly payments of $417. He would sell his DJ equipment immediately to generate a $20,000 payment up front. He would sign an agreement acknowledging that he obtained money from me through fraud and deception. If he missed any payments, we could pursue criminal charges with all the documented evidence we'd gathered. Samuel slid copies of the proposal across the table to Jason's lawyer and to the mediator. Jason's lawyer picked it up and read through it carefully, while Jason sat there looking like he might be sick. His face had gone pale and he kept glancing at me, then looking away. His lawyer finished reading and set the paper down. He cleared his throat and said his client was willing to settle for $30,000 total with no admission of fraud. Samuel didn't even pause before he said no. The mediator wrote something on her notepad and called for a 15-minute break. She stood up and left the room first, and everyone else started gathering their things. Samuel leaned over and spoke to me in a low voice while Jason's lawyer talked to Jason at the other end of the table. He explained that Jason's lawyer was trying to protect him from future legal liability. If Jason signed a document admitting fraud, it could be used against him in other legal proceedings. But we had enough evidence to push harder, and Samuel believed we could get closer to our original proposal. He told me to stay strong and not accept less than what we deserved. The mediator opened the door and reminded everyone that the break was for 15 minutes and we should stay in the building. I stood up and walked out into the hallway with Samuel following behind me. The hallway had beige walls and uncomfortable chairs lined up along one side. A water cooler sat in the corner and I walked over to get a cup. My hands shook slightly as I pressed the button and watched water fill the small paper cup. Jason came out of the conference room and started walking toward me. Samuel immediately stepped between us and held up one hand. He reminded Jason in a firm voice that mediation rules prohibited private contact between parties during breaks. Jason stopped walking, but he kept looking at me like he wanted to say something. His lawyer appeared behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. The lawyer said something I couldn't hear and pulled Jason back toward the conference room. They went inside and closed the door. I stood there holding my cup of water, feeling nothing but complete exhaustion. This whole process had drained something out of me that I wasn't sure I could ever get back. Samuel touched my arm gently and asked if I was okay. I nodded and drank the water even though I wasn't really thirsty. I just needed something to do with my hands. The mediator called us back in after exactly 15 minutes. Everyone took their seats again and the atmosphere felt heavier than before. The mediator asked both sides if they were ready to continue negotiating in good faith. Both lawyers said yes. Then she turned to Jason's lawyer and asked if his client had a revised offer. The lawyer conferred with Jason in whispers for a minute, then said they could go to $35,000 total. Samuel shook his head before the lawyer even finished speaking. He pulled out the bank statements and transfer records and the intercepted mail documentation. He laid it all on the table in neat stacks and said we had clear evidence of fraud spanning 3 years. We had Jason's roommate willing to testify about where the money actually went. We had the medical school's withdrawal records. If this went to court, Jason would face criminal charges and the settlement amount would be much higher. Samuel's voice stayed calm, but every word hit like a hammer. Jason's lawyer looked at the evidence and his expression changed. He asked for another private consultation with his client. The mediator nodded and they moved to a corner of the room to talk quietly. 2 hours passed with offers and counter-offers going back and forth. My head started to hurt from the tension and the fluorescent lights. Finally, we reached an agreement that Samuel said was as good as we were going to get. Jason would pay $40,000 over 8 years with monthly payments of $417. He would sell his DJ equipment for an immediate payment of $15,000. Most importantly, he would sign a document acknowledging that he fraudulently obtained money from me through lies and deception. If he missed 3 consecutive payments, I could pursue criminal charges with all our documented evidence. The mediator read through the terms carefully and asked both parties if they agreed. I said yes. Jason hesitated, then said yes in a voice so quiet I barely heard it. Jason's lawyer also negotiated that Jason would have no contact with me unless I initiated it. Jason had to attend financial counseling for 1 full year with proof of attendance. His lawyer looked unhappy about the fraud acknowledgement, but Samuel had made it clear we would pursue criminal charges otherwise. Jason would likely face much worse consequences if this went to court. The mediator printed out the settlement agreement and everyone reviewed it one more time. She explained that once we signed it would be filed with the court and become an enforceable legal document. Any violation would have serious legal consequences. She asked if everyone understood and we all said yes. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the line next to where it said complainant. My signature looked shaky, but it was done. Jason signed on his line and his hand trembled slightly. Both lawyers signed as witnesses and the mediator signed as the official mediator. She gathered all the copies and said she would file them with the court by the end of the day. I knew I would only recover about $55,000 of the $180,000 he took. It wasn't close to everything I lost, but it was more than I expected when this started. Most importantly, it held Jason legally accountable for what he did to me. The agreement existed now in official records that couldn't be erased or forgotten. Samuel and I walked out of the building together into the afternoon sunlight. I felt lighter somehow, despite knowing I would never get back what I lost. The weight of uncertainty had lifted and been replaced with something concrete and real. Samuel told me the settlement was actually a good outcome given how difficult family fraud cases are to prosecute. Many parents never recover anything at all. The payment plan meant Jason would face consequences for the next 8 years every single month when he made that payment. He couldn't forget what he did or pretend it didn't happen. Samuel shook my hand and said he would send me copies of all the filed documents within a week. I thanked him for everything he'd done and walked to my car alone. 2 weeks later, I checked my bank account and saw a deposit for $15,000 with a reference number from the equipment sale. My heart jumped when I saw it because part of me hadn't believed Jason would actually follow through. I immediately transferred the money into a new retirement account that I opened at a different bank. Jason had no knowledge of this account and never would. It was mine and mine alone and protected in ways my previous accounts hadn't been. I called Alana and told her about the deposit. She congratulated me and said we should meet to set up automatic contributions from my nursing salary. We scheduled an appointment for the following week, and she helped me create a realistic plan for rebuilding my savings over the next 20 years. The numbers still looked scary, but they looked possible now instead of hopeless. The first monthly payment of $417 appeared in my account exactly on the due date. I stared at the transaction on my phone screen, feeling a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Jason was keeping his agreement. Sadness that this was what our relationship had become. A monthly payment that reminded me of everything he took and everything we lost. I called Charlotte and told her about the payment. She asked me how I felt, and I told her I didn't really know. She said that was okay and normal. Some betrayals are too deep to fully heal, and some relationships never recover no matter how much time passes. The important thing was that I was protecting myself and moving forward with my life. Jason's choices were his own, and I couldn't fix him or change him. All I could do was rebuild what he destroyed and make sure he never had the chance to hurt me again. I picked up 1 extra shift per week at the hospital instead of the 2 I was working before. My body needed the break after years of pushing myself past exhaustion. The extra money still helped, but I could actually sleep on my days off now. I met with Alana 2 weeks after the settlement, and she spread out new financial projections across her desk. She showed me how the monthly payments from Jason combined with my nursing salary and careful budgeting meant I could retire at 70 instead of 75. 5 years earlier than we originally calculated when I first came to her office, broken and desperate. The numbers looked possible instead of hopeless, and I felt something close to relief as I studied the charts. Martina called me the following week and suggested I start looking at the rental property market again. She reminded me that I had some settlement money coming in now, and maybe it was time to think about rebuilding that part of my life. I told her I wasn't ready to buy yet, but the idea didn't make me want to cry anymore. I started researching properties online during my lunch breaks at work. Small condos and townhouses that could generate rental income. This time I made notes about keeping everything completely separate and protected. No one would have access to these investments. No one would even know they existed until the paperwork was signed and the properties were mine. 3 months after the mediation ended, Samuel forwarded me a letter from Jason. He explained that Jason had sent it to his office, asking if he could call me to apologize properly. I read the letter twice sitting at my kitchen table. Jason's handwriting looked rushed and the words felt rehearsed, but he was asking for permission to talk. Samuel included a note asking what I wanted to do. I called him back and told him I wasn't ready for contact yet. Maybe someday, but not while I was still rebuilding what Jason destroyed. Samuel said he would respond and let Jason know. He reminded me that I controlled the terms of any future contact, and I should take all the time I needed. I talked about the letter with Charlotte during our next therapy session. She asked me how I felt about Jason reaching out, and I admitted I didn't know. Part of me wanted to hear what he had to say. Part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. Charlotte helped me work through my anger at myself for not seeing the signs earlier. I kept thinking about all the red flags I missed, the vague details about classes, the way he always had an excuse when I asked to visit, the intercepted mail I never questioned. Charlotte pointed out that Jason went to great lengths to maintain his deception. The fake photos in scrubs, the detailed lies about professors and rotations, the carefully crafted stories about his studies. He deliberately exploited my trust and pride in him. She reminded me that I did what any loving parent would do, and he chose to take advantage of that love. 2 weeks later, I joined a support group for parents who experienced financial abuse from adult children. Charlotte recommended it, and I was nervous walking into the community center for the first meeting. 7 other parents sat in a circle, and the facilitator asked us to share our stories if we felt comfortable. I listened to a woman talk about losing her house because her daughter took out credit cards in her name. Another woman depleted her late husband's life insurance, paying for her son's fake business ventures. Several parents were still paying off debt from their children's lies years later. One father maxed out every credit card he had because his son claimed he needed money for cancer treatment that turned out to be completely fabricated. Sharing my story in the group helped me feel less ashamed and isolated. Everyone nodded when I talked about the intercepted mail and the fake photos. They understood the specific kind of betrayal that comes from your own child. The facilitator helped me see that Jason's actions reflected his character, and not my failure as a parent. I did everything right by supporting my child's education. He was the one who chose to exploit that support. Other parents agreed and shared similar realizations from their own experiences. We weren't bad parents. We were good parents who got taken advantage of by people we trusted completely. 6 months into the payment plan, I checked my bank account one morning and didn't see Jason's monthly payment. My stomach dropped, and I immediately thought he was going to default. I called Samuel in a panic, and he told me to wait before doing anything. The agreement required 3 consecutive missed payments before we could take legal action. 3 days later, the payment came through, and Samuel forwarded me an apologetic email Jason had sent, explaining he had an unexpected car repair expense. Samuel reminded me that one late payment didn't trigger any consequences. I needed to breathe and trust the legal protections we built into the agreement. I used some of the settlement money to take a weekend trip with Martina to a beach town we visited as kids. We stayed in a small hotel near the water and spent 2 days walking on the sand and eating at local restaurants. It was the first vacation I had taken in 5 years. Being away from everything helped me remember who I was beyond being Jason's mother or a nurse working double shifts. Martina and I talked about our childhood and our parents and how different our lives turned out from what we imagined. She told me she was proud of how I handled everything with Jason. She said I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. At work the following month, my supervisor called me into her office and offered me a charge nurse position. The role came with a modest salary increase and more responsibility managing the other nurses on my floor. I accepted immediately, knowing the extra income would help my retirement recovery. My supervisor mentioned she noticed I seemed more focused lately, more present during my shifts. I realized that setting boundaries with Jason helped me reclaim energy I was wasting on constant worry. I wasn't checking my phone every hour wondering if he would contact me. I wasn't lying awake at night replaying our last conversation. I was actually living my own life again. Alana reviewed my finances after 8 months and showed me I was actually ahead of our projected savings schedule. Between the settlement payments, my increased salary from the charge nurse position, and cutting unnecessary expenses, I had saved $12,000 toward a rental property down payment. She pulled up property listings in my price range, and we looked at small condos that could work as investments. The numbers made sense now. I could see a path forward that didn't involve working until I died. Alana scheduled our next meeting for 3 months out and told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. I started looking at property listings online during my lunch breaks at the hospital. Small condos in neighborhoods I'd never considered before. Places that needed work but had good bones. I made spreadsheets comparing mortgage rates and rental income potential. Calculated what I could afford if I saved for another year. This time I wasn't desperate or making emotional decisions. I was building something for myself with clear eyes and protected boundaries. The excitement felt different from before. Not the proud parent funding a dream, but an investor protecting her future. I bookmarked 3 properties and scheduled tours for my next day off. Jason's monthly payment hit my account right on schedule the next month. I didn't check obsessively anymore. Alana had set up automatic transfers, so the money went straight into my retirement account without me touching it. I trained myself to think of it as restitution owed rather than something coming from my son. The distinction helped. He wasn't supporting me or helping me. He was paying back what he stole. Some months I forgot to even verify the deposit arrived. That felt like progress. One morning I opened my email and saw a message from Joshua. Subject line said, "New beginnings." He wrote that he'd started a different entertainment company with partners who shared his values. They were doing well booking corporate events and weddings, professional work that paid consistently. He thanked me again for not including him in the legal action against Jason. Said he learned important lessons about checking where money comes from and who you go into business with. He attached a photo of their new office space. Small but legitimate. I wrote back a brief congratulations and deleted the thread. His redemption wasn't my concern. Charlotte asked me during our next session if I felt ready to reduce our appointments. Weekly therapy had helped me process the worst of the anger and grief. I sat there thinking about how I used to obsess over Jason constantly. Now I went whole days without thinking about him at all. My mental energy focused on work and my own financial recovery rather than replaying his betrayals. I told Charlotte I thought bi-weekly sessions made sense. She smiled and said that was healthy progress. We scheduled our next appointment for 2 weeks out. Martina called me on Saturday morning and said she'd found a condo I needed to see. We drove to a neighborhood near the university. The building needed exterior work, and the unit had outdated appliances, but the location was perfect for student rentals and the price reflected its condition. We walked through together while I took notes. Martina pointed out what could be fixed easily and what would cost serious money. I calculated the numbers in my head. If I saved for 6 more months, I could afford the down payment and still have an emergency fund. Standing in that rundown kitchen, I felt capable instead of desperate. I wasn't the woman who sold everything for Jason's lies anymore. I was someone rebuilding with intention and wisdom. 2 years after the mediation, Samuel forwarded me a letter. Jason had sent it through proper legal channels per our agreement. I opened it slowly. His handwriting looked the same. He wrote that he'd been working a regular job for the first time in his life. Finished the required financial counseling. Said he understood now what he took from me. Not just money, but years of my life and my ability to trust. He didn't ask to see me or call. Just wrote that he hoped someday I might forgive him. The letter felt sincere, but I'd believed his sincerity before. I read it 3 times looking for manipulation or excuses. Found mostly accountability and regret. I filed the letter in a folder with all the other legal documents. Didn't respond. Charlotte said during our next session that forgiveness was something I did for myself, not for Jason. That I could forgive the betrayal without reconciling the relationship. I thought about that. Maybe someday I'd get there. Maybe I never would. Both options felt acceptable. I wasn't carrying the anger around like a weight anymore. It existed but didn't define me. That seemed like enough. 3 years after discovering everything, I signed closing papers on the small condo. The young couple who'd be my first tenants seemed responsible and excited. They signed a lease for $200 above my mortgage payment. Martina took me to dinner that night to celebrate. We ordered wine and appetizers and talked about how far I'd come. I felt proud of myself in a way I hadn't felt since before Jason's lies. This accomplishment was mine, built from my own work and smart decisions. Nobody could take it away or devalue it with betrayal. Alana showed me my retirement account balance during our quarterly review. $45,000. Between my contributions, Jason's settlement payments, and market growth, I'd rebuilt a foundation. She pulled up projections showing that if Jason continued paying and I maintained my savings rate, I could retire at 68. Not the retirement I originally planned, but comfortable enough. A modest life I'd earned through my own resilience. The numbers felt real and achievable rather than desperate and impossible. At work, I started mentoring a new nurse named Rebecca. She reminded me of myself at her age, eager to help everyone, quick to trust, generous with her time and money. During a quiet moment in the break room, she told me about supporting her brother through culinary school, sending him money every month. I listened and felt that familiar tightness in my chest. After she finished, I shared a carefully edited version of my story with Jason. Told her that supporting people you love is beautiful, but protecting yourself is necessary. She looked surprised. Said she'd never thought about setting boundaries with family. I told her to think about it now before she learned the hard way like I did. She thanked me, and I hoped she'd actually listen. Some lessons shouldn't require complete devastation to learn. 4 years passed with payments arriving every month like clockwork. I stopped checking my account anxiously and let the automatic deposits build my retirement fund back up. Samuel called one afternoon to tell me Jason's lawyer had reached out about the final payment schedule. Jason wanted to confirm the last 5 months of payments and make sure everything was properly documented. Samuel sounded surprised when he told me this, and I felt something unexpected stir in my chest. Jason was actually following through. He'd paid $35,000 of the $40,000 he owed, and he was planning to finish what he started. I sat with that information for a long time after hanging up with Samuel. During my next session with Charlotte, I mentioned the phone call and admitted I felt a small amount of respect for Jason's consistency. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth after years of anger and disappointment. Charlotte leaned forward and told me this was healthy progress. I could acknowledge positive actions without forgetting the harm he caused or rushing to reconcile. She reminded me that seeing someone do the right thing didn't mean I had to trust them again or let them back into my life. It just meant I could recognize growth without compromising the boundaries that kept me safe. I nodded and felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't know was there. 5 years after sitting in that mediation room, I met with Alana to review my retirement plan. She pulled up my accounts and showed me numbers that made me smile for the first time in a financial meeting. 2 rental properties generating steady income. A retirement account with enough money to support a modest lifestyle. 0 debt. I'd rebuilt approximately 60% of what Jason took from me. Alana pointed out that while it wasn't everything I'd lost, it was enough for a comfortable retirement at 69. I could stop working the extra shifts. I could travel a little. I could live without the constant fear of running out of money. The numbers felt real and achievable instead of desperate and impossible. I signed the paperwork to adjust my retirement contributions and walked out of her office feeling proud of what I'd accomplished through my own determination and smart choices. I think about Jason sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment or walking through the grocery store where this whole nightmare started. I wonder if he genuinely changed or just learned to hide his selfishness better. I wonder if he ever thinks about what he took from me beyond the money. But mostly I think about my own strength in surviving his betrayal and building a new future from the wreckage he left behind. I protected myself when it mattered most. I held him accountable when he expected me to enable him again. I proved that even devastating losses can be recovered from with determination, support from people who actually care, and boundaries I'll never compromise again. My retirement won't be what I originally planned when I sold that rental property and cashed out my 401k. It won't include the extra years of compound interest or the financial security I sacrificed for his fake medical degree. But it will be mine, earned through my own work and protected by lessons I learned the hardest way possible. I built this life from nothing after Jason destroyed everything, and nobody can take it away from me ever again. Well, that wraps up whatever this was. If you stayed until the end, I assume curiosity got the best of you. Might as well come back next time and see if I top it.